Wyoming Territory, 1877, the wind was sharp that morning, dragging dust across the plains as 26-year-old cowboy Truett Adler rode east out of Dawson Ridge, chasing a missing calf. He had not planned on saving a life before noon. But that was before he saw her tied to a post like a criminal out in the open, wrists raw, ankles swollen, and her belly round with child. She looked half-conscious, her dark hair clinging to her face, lips cracked from the dry air. Truett's heart slammed in his chest like it aimed to break free. He kicked his boot into the stirrup, dismounted fast, and ran the last few feet. "Miss Hay, you awake? Can you hear me?" Her lashes fluttered. "Water," she whispered, voice dry as gravel. Truett pulled his canteen off his belt and held it to her lips. She drank slow, careful, like she had learned not to trust too much too fast. When he pulled the gag loose from her mouth, she winced but didn't cry. He untied her wrists, then knelt to cut the rope around her ankles. "Who did this to you?" She looked up at him then. Eyes brown like river mud after a storm, sharp despite the pain. "My stepbrother. He said I embarrassed the family, said I should die out here." Truett sucked in a breath. "Because of the baby," she nodded once. "And because I refused to marry the man he picked." He stood and pulled his duster off, wrapping it around her shoulders. "Let's get you out of here." She tried to stand, but her knees buckled. "I got you," he said, lifting her with gentle arms. She was light, too light for someone carrying a child. Truett carried her to his horse and mounted up, settling her in front of him, his arms protectively around her. "What's your name?" "Aven Mayfield." "I'm Truett Adler." "You are safe now, Aven." As they rode, she leaned back against his chest, breath shallow, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. Truett adjusted his grip, making sure she felt steady. The wind picked up again, but it did not matter anymore. He had someone to protect. By the time they reached Dawson Ridge, the sun had climbed high, and people stood still in the street, watching as Truett rode through town with a pregnant woman bundled in his coat. Sheriff Danner stepped out of the jailhouse, brows pinched. "What happened?" "Found her tied to a post out east." "Near Miller's Bluff." "God Almighty," the sheriff muttered, rushing over. "She's got nothing, no food, no water, no place to go," Truett added. Aven stirred. "I do not want pity." "You have my respect," the sheriff said. "You survived." Miss Aliner, who ran the boarding house, stepped forward from the crowd. "She can stay with me. I have a spare room." Aven's hand gripped Truett's arm. "Please, I do not want to be alone." Truett met her eyes. "You won't be," the sheriff looked at him. "You sure about that, Adler?" "I am." So it began. Truett carried her inside with Aliner guiding the way. People whispered. Some looked disapproving, but others nodded, eyes soft. Dawson Ridge was a hard town, but not heartless. In the days that followed, news spread like wildfire. The cowboy who brought back a pregnant bride tied to a post. The man who stood between her and judgment. Truett took to watching over Aven like it was his life's purpose. He spent his nights on a cot downstairs, and his days helping her walk again, her ankles still bruised. He brought her apples she could stomach, read to her when the nights dragged on too long, and never once asked about the man who got her with child. One evening, as the fire crackled low in Aliner's parlor, Aven spoke. "I was supposed to marry a banker in Missouri. My stepbrother arranged it. But I was already carrying another man's child. The man left me behind before I could tell him." Truett's jaw tensed. "He knew." "No, but I think he would have left anyway. You deserve better than that." She looked at him, steady. "Why are you helping me?" "Because I have seen men like your stepbrother walk away clean, and I have seen women like you carry the weight alone. I am not letting that happen again." Aven's hand reached for his. "You do not even know me." "I know enough." That night, Truett stayed by her side when the wind howled loud outside the windows. He read from a book of poems Aliner kept on the mantel, and Aven drifted off with her head resting on his shoulder. Something had broken open between them, quiet but real. A week later, Aven stood in front of the general store, her hand resting on her belly as Truett returned from the blacksmith. "You are limping," she said, concerned. "Horse threw a shoe. I had to walk him back." She frowned. "You should not always be saving things, Truett Adler." Why not? Because no one ever saves you. He stared at her for a moment, the wind lifting strands of her hair. Then he said, maybe you are doing that already. Aven flushed, looking away, but she did not let go of his hand. Later that afternoon, a letter arrived from Missouri. Alina brought it in wary. It is addressed to you, Aven. Aven opened it slow, lips trembling as she read. Then she tore it in half. He wants nothing to do with the child, she said softly, Truett's jaw clenched. Then he was never worth your tears. Aven nodded. I think I knew that before. That night, Truett fixed a loose shutter on Alina's porch. Aven brought him a cup of coffee and sat beside him on the steps. I think the baby's moving, she whispered. He looked over, startled. Now, she took his hand, gently placed it over her belly. A small bump fluttered beneath his palm. Truett swallowed hard. That's incredible. She smiled at him, tired but content. It is. In that moment, Truett realized he would never let her go. Not because she needed saving, but because being near her made him feel like a man worth something. And for the first time in years, Aven let herself hope. She looked out into the dark, then back at him. Do you ever think about what comes next? Truett nodded. Every day. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I think I want to stay. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her in closer. Then stay. And inside the house, behind the curtain, Alina smiled to herself. Because the cowboy had not just rescued a woman, he had found something he did not even know he had been looking for. Love. The snow came early that year, fine and dry like sifted flour, brushing over Dawson Ridge in a hush. Truett stood on the porch of the boarding house, hammering an iron hook into the post so Alina could hang her lanterns before the frost set in. The wind cut across the road, and somewhere down near the livery, a horse kicked against its stall. Aven stepped out behind him, wrapped in a shawl Alina had sewn from wool scraps. Her cheeks were pink from the heat of the fire inside, and her hair was damp from washing. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him finish his work. You ever think about leaving? She asked. He didn't turn right away. Used to. Thought maybe I'd ride clear to Colorado, take work in the timber camps or trapping elk. But I never got past the state line. What stopped you? Didn't feel right, leaving a place that raised me tough when I owed it something gentler in return. She considered that. I always imagined I'd live near water, something wide. A river you could hear at night. You still could. Her gaze drifted toward the distant hills. Too late for that now. No, it ain't. A wagon creaked past, two men in thick coats riding low in their seats. One tipped his hat to Aven. She hesitated before nodding back. Inside, the fire crackled, and Alina's feet could be heard moving slowly across the floorboards as she arranged her preserves. Truett waited until the wagon disappeared before speaking again. I've been putting boards together, he said. Building something out back, just a small place. Nothing fancy. Aven looked at him, puzzled. For who? Well, I figured you'd need a home of your own once the baby's here. I wasn't going to say anything till it had walls. Her fingers tightened around the shawl. You're building me a house, he nodded, looking down at the hammer still in his hand. Didn't know how else to say I want you to stay. Her silence stretched long, but it wasn't distant. I used to think love was something I could earn, she said finally. If I behaved the right way, said the right things. But it didn't matter. They still treated me like I was disposable once I made a mistake. He set the hammer on the rail and stepped toward her. You didn't make a mistake, you made a life. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. I don't know how to be with someone who doesn't expect me to pay for everything with a piece of myself. I'm not asking you to give anything you don't want to. She reached for his hand, her fingers cold. What if I want to? Truett swallowed hard. The sky behind her was turning to slate, dusk settling early in the cold. He brought her hand to his chest. Then I'll build that house slow, one board at a time. And you can decide, piece by piece, if you want to stay in it. Aven nodded once, her shoulders rising with a breath that sounded more like relief than anything else she'd ever shown. That night, Alina sat by the fire with her mending, humming something soft and half-forgotten. Truett read a letter from his older cousin in Green River. asking if the rumors were true that he'd taken in a woman with a child not his own. Aven sat nearby, stitching a bonnet from muslin. She glanced at the letter, then back at her needle. "Will you answer him, eventually?" "What will you say?" He folded the paper slow. "I'll say that she's not mine by blood, but she's mine just the same." Aven didn't speak for a moment, then she reached out and laid the bonnet in his lap. "For when she comes," she said. "I think it's a girl." He turned the bonnet in his hands, rough fingers brushing over the tiny seams. "You sure?" "No, but I feel her, and I think she'll be quiet and stubborn like you." Truett's mouth lifted at the edge, worn and gentle. "Then I reckon I better be ready." As the fire burned low and the snow pressed against the window panes, neither of them moved from their chairs. Their hands rested on the same blanket, just close enough to touch, and outside the town held its breath, not yet knowing the kind of love that was being built in silence, stronger than anything spoken aloud. The first real storm came on a Thursday night, wind howling through Dawson Ridge like it had teeth. Truett braced the boards around the half-built cabin behind Aliner's place by lantern light, steadying the frame with thick rope and his own weight. By morning, the snow had crusted over every step and fence post, and the sky hung low and gray. Inside, Aven sat near the stove with a bowl of broth cooling in her lap, her hands trembling more than they had the day before. She hadn't said much since the wind started. Truett noticed but didn't press. Instead, he brought in chopped wood and set her shawl over the back of her chair where the heat could reach it. When he finally sat down, she turned toward him, her voice low. "I had a dream last night," she said. "I was back in Missouri, but the house was empty. Every door led to the same room." He didn't speak right off. He knew better than to fill silence that carried weight. "I think I was looking for someone," she continued. "Not the man who left, someone else, but I never found him." Truett reached for her hand where it rested on her knee. "You woke up," she nodded once. "Only when I stopped opening the doors." He let that settle, then said, "You ever think maybe the door you needed was behind you?" That made her smile, faint but real. Aliner stepped in from the cold, arms full of fresh linens. "The midwife's coming through from Rawlins next week. She sent word with the freight team. I told her we'd need her soon." Aven's expression shifted, nervous and proud all at once. "She's early." "Not by much," Aliner said, laying the linens across the back of the settee. "But you'll want someone who knows what she's doing." After Aliner left the room, Aven leaned back, her voice quieter. "What if I can't do it, Truett?" He met her eyes. "You will, and I'll be here the whole time." She looked down at her lap. "I wasn't supposed to have someone beside me." "Well, you do now." The next day, Truett rode out early to help the Granger family bring their cattle in ahead of the next freeze. Hours in the saddle left his hands raw and his coat stiff with frozen sweat, but he made it back by dusk, boots heavy with ice. He found Aven sitting at the window, watching the snow fall in slow spirals. "I thought maybe you wouldn't come back," she said without looking at him. He pulled off his gloves, flexing his fingers. "There's not a thing out there I'd rather be doing than coming home to you." She turned, and something in her softened. "You called it home." He hung his coat and stepped into the room. "It feels like that." That night, she asked him to sit beside her on the quilt Aliner had stitched from old feed sacks. They didn't speak for a long while. Her fingers rested on the curve of her stomach and his hand rested near hers, not touching. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "My mother died giving birth to me." He looked up, quiet. "I think that's why my stepbrother hated me, said I took more than I gave. You didn't take anything. That blame's not yours to carry." Aven's jaw worked, but she didn't cry. "I've tried not to think about it, but now that I'm close. I wonder if I'll see her, if she'll be there just for a moment before the baby comes. If she's anything like you," he said, "she'll be there the whole time." Outside, snow dusted the windowsills. Aven reached for his hand, her grip stronger than he expected. He turned his palm to hers. No words passed after that, but something old and aching eased between them. 3 days later, the midwife arrived, a tall woman with a voice like split timber and hands that knew birth the way Truett knew horses. She took one look at Aven and nodded. Won't be long now. Truett worked faster on the cabin, hammering each nail with quiet focus. The roof was half laid, the floor still just planking, but the walls stood strong. He kept the fire going in the house and made sure Aven ate, even when her appetite failed. One morning, just before sunrise, Aven touched his shoulder. It's time. He rose without panic, just moved to her side, steady as ever. The midwife worked through the day and deep into the night, and Truett never left the room. He didn't speak unless Aven asked him to, just kept a cool cloth ready and held her hand when she reached for him, firm and sure as a rail post. When the child came, the cry pierced the stillness like sunlight through fog. A girl, red-faced and fierce, her fists balled as if ready to fight the whole world. Aven sagged back, her hair plastered to her neck, eyes wet with exhaustion and wonder. "She's here," she whispered. Truett took the baby when the midwife offered her, cradling the weight of her like he was holding fire and water at once. He knelt beside Aven and laid the child in her arms. "She looks like you," he said. Aven met his gaze, tears slipping freely down her cheeks now. "No. She looks like all the pieces I thought I'd lost." He pressed a kiss to her temple, careful not to jostle her. "She's whole. Just like you." And in that quiet room, with snow still falling beyond the glass and a new life blinking up at them, Aven Mayfield and Truett Adler became more than a woman and a cowboy. They became a family. No one in town said much about it in the days that followed, but everyone noticed how Truett walked straighter, how Aven's eyes no longer scanned the horizon like she was waiting for something to catch up. And when the cabin was finally finished and they carried the baby over the threshold wrapped in a leaner's quilt, no one questioned it. Because some stories don't need telling once they're written in the way people look at each other. By early spring, the ground began to thaw in patches, revealing the trampled remains of winter beneath. The river south of Dawson Ridge swelled with snowmelt, and the cottonwoods along its banks shook loose their frost. Truett stood near the barn one morning, splitting fence rails with slow, even swings. Each strike of the axe echoed down the valley like a promise being made. Inside the cabin, Aven moved carefully around the main room, her daughter nestled against her chest in a sling she'd stitched from muslin and calico. The baby had settled into her rhythms, crying only when hungry, sleeping in broken stretches, her tiny fingers curling tight whenever they brushed skin. Aven had grown quieter in some ways, more steady. Her hands no longer trembled when she pinned laundry or poured water from the kettle. She still wore the same shawl, but now she folded it open when the sun came through the windows. Later that day, with the child asleep in a leaner's arms, Aven stepped outside to find Truett hitching the mule to the small cart he used for supply runs. She waited until he looked over. "Are you going into town? Need to get flour and seed. Shouldn't be more than a few hours. I'd like to come with you." He paused, brushing dust from his hands. "You sure you're ready? I need to be seen, not hidden." He didn't ask anything further. Just nodded once and helped her into the cart, laying a folded wool blanket behind her back without a word. The road into Dawson Ridge was still rutted from the freeze, and the cart jolted more than once, but she didn't flinch. When they reached town, people turned to look, same as they always had. But something had shifted in the way they stared. Some lifted their hats, others gave a quiet nod. No one spoke cruelly. That silence, Aven found, meant more than any spoken apology. Truett pulled up in front of the mercantile and handed her down. "I'll load the seed." "Take your time." Inside, the shop was warm with stove heat and smelled of kerosene and dried apples. Mr. Barrow, the owner, glanced up from his ledger. "Miss Mayfield, good to see you up and about." She blinked at the ease in his voice. "Thank you." He gestured toward the bolts of fabric. "Got some new calico in, blue and cream, thought it might suit the little one." She stepped closer, brushing her fingers over the cloth. "She'd like that." As she turned to leave, he cleared his throat. "You need anything for her, diapers or such, you just say." "No child of Dawson Ridge goes without if I can help it." Outside, Truett had already stacked the feed sacks and was tying them down tight. She climbed into the cart beside him, her face unreadable. He waited until they'd cleared the last row of buildings before speaking. "You all right? I don't think I ever knew what kindness looked like until now. You'll get used to it." She looked at him then, her voice low. "I hope not." That evening, with the baby asleep in the cradle Truett had carved from pine and lined with spare flannel, Aven stood at the washbasin, sleeves rolled, rinsing the dust from her hands. Truett came in behind her, setting a small parcel on the table. She turned. "What's that?" Barrow said. "You like the calico." She unfolded it slow. The cream was soft, the blue pale like sky just after dawn. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to." She laid the cloth flat against the table, smoothing the edge. "When I was little, I used to imagine I'd sew my own wedding dress. Nothing fancy, just something I made with my own hands." He leaned against the post, arms crossed. "Still could." She glanced up. "You offering?" He didn't move, just said, "I'm asking." Her eyes didn't leave his. "You know what I've been, what I carry. I know what you are and what you've made of it." Her breath caught, but she didn't look away. "I want to be yours, not because I owe you anything, but because you're the first man I've ever trusted to see me whole." He stepped forward, slow, and took her hands in his, thumbs brushing her knuckles. "Then marry me. Let's raise that girl with both our names behind her." She nodded once. "Yes." Outside, the last of the snow slid from the roof with a soft thud. Inside, nothing needed saying after that. They didn't rush. There was no need. The days that followed were filled with the quiet, steady work of setting a life in place. Truett added shelves to the cabin walls. Aven began stitching the calico, not into a dress but a quilt, each square a piece of something new. One morning, Eleanor walked the baby out to the porch, wrapped warm in her shawl, and handed her to Truett. "She's getting strong," Eleanor said. "Just like her mother." Truett held the child close, his voice quiet. "We'll give her a name that means something." And when Aven joined him at the door, her hand resting on his arm, she said, "Let's call her Mercy." He looked down at the child in his arms, then back at the woman beside him. "That suits her just fine." And nothing needed to be shaken anymore. It had already happened. The spring wedding was held beneath the cottonwoods near the riverbank, where the water moved slow and clear, full from the thaw. Aven stood barefoot in the soft grass, her skirt hem brushing the earth, the quilt she'd sewn wrapped around her shoulders instead of a veil. Truett faced her in his Sunday coat, the collar tugged straight by Eleanor just minutes before, his boots newly polished but still worn at the toes. Mercy lay asleep in the crook of Eleanor's arm, her bonnet tied snug beneath her chin. The child stirred once as the preacher spoke, then settled again, her breath warm against Eleanor's blouse. Truett's voice didn't waver when he said the words, nor did Aven's when she answered. The vows were simple. No promises of perfection, only of steadiness. Of hands held through storms and shoulders leaned on when the weight became too much. When the preacher stepped back, Truett lifted Aven's hand to his lips and kissed the inside of her wrist, just below the edge of her sleeve. She closed her eyes at the gesture, and when she opened them again, he was still looking at her like there was nothing else in the world worth seeing. Afterward, there was coffee and bread sweetened with molasses, and a fiddle tune carried across the grass by a boy from the livery who played with half his teeth missing and all his heart showing. The town gave what it could: crocheted blankets, a pair of carved spoons, a cradle rocker someone had sanded smooth. No one said a word about where Aven had come from or how she'd arrived. That part was done with. Later, as the sun dipped low and turned the cottonwoods gold, Truett and Aven walked back to the cabin with Mercy tucked in the sling between them. The door creaked open under his hand, and the light inside was soft from the oil lamp Eleanor had left burning. "She hung that curtain," Aven said, nodding toward the window. "I didn't even notice. She said it was time the place looked lived in." Aven stepped to the cradle and laid Mercy down, tucking a piece of flannel beside her cheek. The child breathed deep, her hands twitching as she dreamed. "I never thought I'd come to love a place like this," Aven said, her voice quiet. Then I guess we'll just have to keep surprising each other, Truett replied, setting his coat over the back of the chair. She turned, her face lit by the lamplight. You think we can grow anything in that patch near the river? Peas, maybe, carrots if we keep the rabbits off. I've got seed for barley, we'll see what takes. She moved toward him, resting her hand on his chest. I want to plant roots, not just for her. For me, you already have. He bent his head to kiss her, slow and sure. Her fingers found the buttons of his shirt, tracing the space between them like she was learning it all over again. When he pulled her close, she let herself settle against him without hesitation. They didn't speak again that night, but the silence between them was full. The kind that comes from knowing the worst has passed and what's left is good and real and growing. The days that followed were ordinary in the best way. Truett repaired the barn roof with help from a neighbor who owed him a favor. Aven stitched dresses for Mercy from flour sacks Aliner dyed with onion skins and elderberry. The baby learned to grip Truett's finger with fierce determination, and when she laughed for the first time, it happened while he was bouncing her gently in the crook of his arm, his face near hers. Aven heard the sound from the porch and came running, her eyes wide, not with fear, but with wonder. "Do it again," she whispered, and Truett did again and again until the child's laughter filled the house like sunlight. They grew things together, rows of sweet peas, a handful of cabbage heads, a stand of corn too thin but still stubborn. On the evenings when the work was done, they sat on the porch with their knees touching, watching the light fade and Mercy sleep, and they spoke of years to come. Of maybe building another room, of teaching her to read, of what to name the next child if there ever was one. One morning in late August, Aven found a robin's nest beneath the eaves with 3 blue eggs inside. She called Truett over and they stood shoulder to shoulder, looking up. "New life just keeps finding us," she said. "Seems it knows where to land now." She leaned into him and didn't move for a long time. The seasons turned and with them came new tasks, new rhythms. But the love between them held. It held through early frosts and long rains, through Mercy's first steps and the quiet joy of watching her discover the world with wide, curious eyes. And in that cabin at the edge of Dawson Ridge, with the fields stretching out and the river steady in its course, Truett and Aven built a life rooted deep in the soil of second chances. Nothing grand, nothing loud, just true. They never left. They never needed to. Because everything they'd ever hoped for had already come home.